Well, hello, and welcome to the Yellow Coat Club podcast. My name is Sean Little, and today is January 1st. Dun dun dun. I think for many today can either be a day of excitement, maybe a little bit scared or, a little timid about entering into, this new year with these new plans and the new me. Or today can also be one of those reminders of, where we wish we were, but not having, the whatever, the power, the, whatever belief that we're carrying that says that we can't go do those things that we feel like we're called to. Or the list that stacks up of the I wish I coulds, but I'm stuck here and I don't see a way forward. Regardless of where you're at, you're listening to this podcast and journeying through this with me today. And so, I have, I have some story to share today. As I thought about this podcast and as I thought about, just what was God putting on my heart was, I remembered back in January 1st, 2019. So for those of you that don't know, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for almost 6.5 years. And there was a time in my life where, I lived in denial, avoidance. I masked all of my pain with, self-medicating. And for me, there was a plethora of things that I used, but the main driver, always the main driver, was alcohol. And in my mind, alcohol was my friend, and I didn't need a reason, or every moment seemed like a reason for me to indulge in that behavior. And sadly, it was the same thing that, I thought was helping me, and it was destroying my life. And so, in June of 2018, I had this moment where I said, for the first time out loud, I'm an alcoholic. And there was so much power in saying that out loud because it was the first time that I had admitted something that I had known for a really, really, really long time. When you're in your early 20s, and it was funny, I was talking to a friend recently, one of my really good friends who was just there with me, in my early 20s, and we're still friends to this day. And, we were just kind of talking about, the book that I had written, but then also just alcoholism in general. And it was so interesting because he was like, yeah, if I look back now, the signs were there, but we just kind of all like thought that's what you did at that age. There was the games that we would play of, who can drink the most and, 30 rack and a friend, and, it's just crazy to look back and see how that was so normalized. But for me in life, as I saw everyone growing up and kind of growing out of those old ways, it's as if I doubled down. And there were many things in my life that I would cut out, in my journey, thinking that these weren't serving me anymore. But the one thing that nobody could ever touch, and if they tried to, I just pushed them away, was drinking. I always needed to have the drink. And as long as I had that, it was almost as if I had this warm, cozy blanket on, and it was madness. And so in June, I said those words, but to be very honest with you, it was another 15 months before I ever experienced the healing that needed to happen, the shaking of my world that needed to happen in order for me to go live, or at least start living the life that God created me to live. And so, during that time, I was unwilling to accept certain realities that were, in my life. One of those was that I was never going to be a normal drinker again. During this time, I remember telling people, and it was true. I liked going out to breweries. I liked the camaraderie. I liked the community that it brought, even if, all of us were getting drunk, and probably me more drunk than everybody else. It was something that we could do and pass the time. And what's really sad is I kind of thought, maybe at some point, if I could just get this under control, if I could limit myself, if I could figure out, a hack, or if I could go without for some time, that I would, quote unquote, be normal again. And so in that desire to be normal, I never gave up or accepted the reality that if you struggle with addiction, if you are an alcoholic, personally for me, there's no going back. Once, they say once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. I don't identify as an alcoholic anymore in my life, but I definitely identify as somebody who cannot go out drinking and live to tell the tale. I firmly believe and know that if I were to go back drinking, that everything in my life would fall apart and go crumbling to the ground. So, call it what it is, but spade is spade. But during this time, I wouldn't accept that reality. And so I would, go about and, I'd have a week or maybe 2 weeks, maybe even a month of, sobriety. And then I'd go right back to drinking. And then I would feel all of the shame. I'd carry all of that weight and I'd say, oh my gosh, I want this to stop. And then, I would quit, but then I would keep going back. I hadn't developed that muscle yet, that the desire to stop outweighing the desire to be normal, at least in my mind. And now, even when I say it, it sounds funny because it's like a normal drinker. I just wanted to be able to drink without all of the bad crap happening in my life. And the reality is that if you want at least as much of that bad crap to stop, you just need to stop. So here I am, fresh off a relapse, and I go into an AA room. It's January 1st, 2019. And I go in and I sit down at this table and I sit down to this gentleman that I've, talked to intermittently over, the past couple months that I had seen while I was in recovery. And I looked at him and my eyes were heavy, snowing outside. I felt like garbage. And I just looked over at him and, he could tell. I didn't look like somebody who had just brought in the new year in a very new and exciting way. I was, 6 hours off of, or one sleep off of, a bender. So he looked at me and, how are you doing? I just looked at him. I said, I just relapsed again. And I looked at him and I said, when does it stop? And he looked at me, and I'll never forget this. He simply said, when you stop digging. Now imagine in that moment, I'm sick and tired of all of the crap happening in my life. I'm weighed down by my choices. I feel shame. And all the while, I ask this simple question, when does it stop? And somebody looks at me and they said, when you stop digging. I've thought about this image so many times that imagine you're digging a hole, and you're like, well, why does this thing keep getting deeper? Like I don't even want to be in here doing this. And then you look around and you see the side walls. You even look at the shovel that you're holding in your hand. And you realize that you are the person doing it. It wasn't somebody else that was out there making me drink. My past circumstances that were causing me to drink. I mean, think about it. I had all of the reasons that I ever came up with in my mind to drink. And the problem is that it was all me. It was something that I had fabricated as a story to give myself permission to do the exact thing that I said is creating so much chaos in my life. Like the actual insanity of just think of that. And it was me. And I had to, in that moment, sit there and grapple with this very real truth that I was the one that was causing the problems in my life. Nobody was to blame. I was the one to blame. And so the question, when does the pain stop? When does this stop? It's like, when you stop. The sad reality of that moment is it was just one of those times that you think, hey, so did you stop drinking? No. I would go through more relapses, a job loss, shame, guilt, fear, feeling like I was about to fail out of my grad school program, death. I mean, you name it. I had to experience all of these things to get to my end finally, to where I said, I'm done digging. The problem is that 9 months later, if you can imagine, that hole was much deeper than when I asked that original question. And so the lingering question is, what gives? There was this reality that I had to come to, that eventually I was going to either have to stop drinking, or my life was going to plummet beyond anything that I could imagine. And as you're listening to these words today, it doesn't have to be something like drinking or a substance. It can be a resentment that you're holding on to, a bitterness that you're holding on to, a conversation that needs to be had, a job that you're in that you need to leave, a toxic relationship that you're in that you know is done. And yet we keep returning to it. And deep down, I feel like there's this thing that we know, that there's this inevitable, I'm going to leave. What are you waiting for? I ask myself that question all of the time. What are you waiting for? When are you going to stop digging? Do you want to do this 9 months from now, or do you want to do it today? Because the problem is that what we would love to do is that, hey, 9 months down the road, this thing will figure itself out. You sure? How well has that worked for you in the past? I heard something the other day that, and I'm most likely going to butcher it, but it was talking about the security of slavery is oftentimes easier than the uncertainty of freedom. And when I listened to it, there was a Pastor Erwin McManus from Mosaic Church who said that. I was listening to it, and I realized how oftentimes we know the answer of the thing that we need to do, that really hard thing that we need to do, and yet we find every excuse not to go do that. We'd rather keep digging the hole and going down into the trench further and further and further. And for me, think about that, 9 months later, I felt like my life was over. If I had stopped, we always want that do-over, that replaying of the tape. If I could have just gone back and listened to that person's advice at that moment, I could have foregone, insert all of the other pains. Now, it doesn't mean that pain didn't teach a lesson. But at some point in life, as we experience these exact kind of moments where it's like, man, if I could have just learned then, at some point we have to ask the question, when are we going to start learning that really hard thing that we know that we need to do right now? Let's do it right now. But it was easier to just keep my head down and dig instead of looking up. Fast forward that, a year later, I brought in the new year sober. And I've brought in other new years since then sober, because I had to come to a realization that when it came to drinking, I just couldn't go back. I think how often, it's easy to reminisce on the past. In fact, it's easy to glorify the past. And yet, think about how many fun, drunken nights that I had of, throwing away money essentially. And those aren't the memories that I cherish the most. They aren't the things that have made who I am. They aren't the things that have made me feel alive. But it was the thing that I thought that I needed in my life. And I was unwilling to give up because I was scared of what was ahead of me. And so there's, as I think about just this metaphor of digging, there's so many reasons that we do it, We do it for control. We do it because it's familiar. It's predictable. I mean, think you have the same motion over and over and over. Doesn't mean it's any less miserable. But we know it. I didn't know another way. And yet I was so annoyed that day because I knew he was right. I knew he was right. And it was a truth that I didn't want to face. And so today, I'm confronted by that lingering question of, even asking, where do I need to stop digging in my life? Where do I need to, make that quick change? Where do I need to turn around? I don't want to live a life of regret. And I think, for a lot of people that I talk to, that's something that seems all too familiar. It's easy to regret the past, but then also try and live there. Now, I can't get those years back, but I can, think about where I am today and go, what kind of life do I want to live while I'm still here? What kind of life, does God want me to live while I'm still here? As we sit down and we make our plans for, 2026 and beyond, I had that next question of really just how often have I tried to control or manage and say, hey, here's where I'm going to go, versus placing this before and, asking that simple question, God, where do you want me to go? And there's so many areas of life where it's just easy to think that if I just keep pressing ahead, if I just keep digging, maybe I'll end up, there's that, you're digging in your backyard and eventually you'll end up in China. We think that as we keep plugging away, doing the thing that we're currently doing, if I just keep grinding, that, I'll end up with the result. And sometimes we need to ask ourselves, what would it look like to just stop? What would it look like to relinquish the shovel to somebody else and actually, I think I'm done here. And invite God into that space and say, hey, where I'm going. Would you show me? And what would that expose inside of me to even say that? There's such a discomfort of not knowing what presses ahead. Something that's been, I think a struggle. I know a struggle in, my marriage with Charlotte is, she's a little bit more free-spirited than I am. And I like to have things planned out. I like to know what's going on. And when I think about the times in my life where I saw God the most, it was when I let go of having everything controlled. When I packed up, all of my belongings and moved to Mexico, I didn't know what I was going to embark on. I knew that I was putting my stuff in a car. I knew that I was driving, across the border, and I was going to go live at an orphanage, and that's all I knew. I didn't know the language, even weird vanity things like where was I going to get my hair cut and where was I going to get my hair product. And so I actually, because I didn't know the answers to those questions, I remember early on, I ended up going and shaving my head. Like, it was such a weird thing to do. I ended up shaving my head because I was like, well, if I just go shave my head, I'm not going to have to worry about any of these things. And it was ironic and kind of hilarious in the sense that, I went and I shaved my head and was like, well, now if I ever have an issue of going bald, I know what I'm up against. And so that was one of those just crazy moments where I was able to, it sounds silly, but be free. It was unplanned. And then in my time in Mexico, I got to learn the language. I stayed there longer than I thought. I got to experience so much life with these beautiful young children and just see them, grow up, see the smiles on their faces. And that was unplanned. I got to go experience, another state in Mexico and visit a few other of the states in Mexico and hang out with missionaries that were out in the mountains. And it was all so unplanned. And it was the most beautiful parts of my life. And somehow when I came back to the States, I remember it was almost as if my faith became domesticated. When I first came to Phoenix to go visit my wife, it was unplanned. When I, applied for jobs and didn't have any housing, it was all so unplanned. And when it's unplanned, when I'm not sitting there trying to create structure around everything, I was able to see God work in crazy awesome ways because I wasn't sitting there trying to control every single situation. And I feel like somehow over the last couple years, it's gotten so much about achieving and being driven by those old stories once again and those desires and those wants that I have overplanned myself into just a complete lack of spontaneity. And inside of that, this not being able to experience God in the way in which I really feel like I could and I would like to. And so even as I, think about, where am I digging, and need to hand over the shovel is, dude, like it's good to plan, make plans. And also, if you're always just driving from point A to point B and never stopping to smell the flowers, then what's so important about the destination that you can't enjoy the journey? And that is a mirror moment for me. That is a huge mirror moment for me. And that kind of, it's an area of my life that I know I need to hand back over to God. Because I don't think that I'm going to experience the life that God created for me in its fullest until I can hand that back over and stop controlling all of these situations. I need to hand that shovel over and say, hey, I know that I got to do the work. But I'm going to start being more receptive to where you're going to guide me. Christ says to, his disciples, when he's calling them, he says, follow me. He doesn't give them the roadmap to everything. He just says, follow me. They were able to sit at his feet and follow and go do incredibly beautiful things. Even when, he talks about coming back again, he's like, be ready. The hour could come at any point. And if I spend so much time trying to plan my life, that lack of spontaneity or leading where God wants me to go is not going to happen. And the regret that I'm going to live with is, man, I wish I would have risked more. I wish I would have journeyed into fear a little bit more. For me, it's playing it safe. predictable, safe. I need to learn to pivot in my life. And be open to the idea that just as I quit drinking and relinquish this thing that was destroying my life, but also relinquishing this thing that on the other side of that was an invitation into becoming the person that I was created to be, at least the start. And I have that moment as I look and, you still set targets, you still set goals. You don't aimlessly wander in the future just hoping that it's going to happen. But there's this harmony saying, hey, God, here's where I feel like you're calling me to go. But all along the way, help me to stop and smell the roses. To take that little detour because I felt you calling me there. You can plan your life into so much rigidity, and in that rigidity, never experience the mystery that God has waiting for us. I just got done reading a book by my favorite pastor, Erwin McManus. It's called The Barbarian Way. He talked about faith and how so much of our faith journey has become domesticated and civilized when you look at the life of Jesus and his followers before that, and it was anything but domesticated and civilized. Even in looking at what Jesus did for us onto the cross and literally suffered for us. His full expression of love. And to think that, I'm no Jesus. But to think that life's supposed to be all cookie cutter and planned out and, oh yeah, I'm going to live passionately for the Lord as long as it fits into my plan. No. He said, follow me. And as I move into 2026, I've got my targets. I've got my goals. I've got plans. I'll share them along the way. But I started rereading another book of his called The Last Arrow. And the premise is this, and hopefully I do it justice, but it's that you have a quiver of arrows that you are given in this life, and you get to take none with you to the next. And the question is, what are you going to be striking them at? When I first met my wife, her and I went on a date, but it wasn't a date. It was a date. I call it our first date. But it was 3 days into being in Phoenix before I even knew I was going to move here. And we went on this hike. She was showing me the city. And I remember going to the top of this mountain and looking out, and you could see all of Phoenix. Or at least a huge portion of it. And I was telling her about this book. And I was talking about what I was going to shoot my arrows at. And I felt this stirring, this barbaric nature in my soul that I was just going to go after everything that I felt God was calling me to do. And I remember looking at her, and she had said, oh, what are you shooting your arrows at? And I said, ask me in 6 months. It was my fun way of being like, yeah, you're one of them. And yet, over time, I felt like there was this domestication that happened. I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go, make this career move, and I'm going to go get this job. And, it at some point felt really self-serving. And so I don't have all of the answers, but I do know that one of the things that I need to hand over this year is trying to cookie cutter, predictable life, put everything into this and go, I need to know the full plan. Instead of just simply going, God, I'm going to trust you. And if you've read the Yellow Coat Club, and if you haven't, literally, one of the last chapters, it just says, follow me. And every time I listen to that voice, follow me, in my mind, it's almost like, hey, hand me the shovel, stop digging, follow me. Well, where are we going? Don't worry about that. I know where we're going. And it's going to require trust, but also you're going to go to places and experience things that you couldn't possibly imagine. Because my ways, my methods, everything, far greater than yours. Can you humble yourself to do that? Can you stop digging? Can you hand me the shovel and follow me? And so that's the question that I've postured myself as I look to 2026. Hey, you speak, I'll follow. And even in saying that, there's this nervousness, this anxiety, because who knows what's going to be on the other side. And yet, even as I say these words, what I love the most is that I'm going to be able to revisit and listen to this and go, man, you remember when you said this? Made this stake in the ground on January 1st, 2026. And if my life looks the exact same this time next year, even if you don't know me, send me an email, whatever, and be like, hey, you said that you were going to start following, you didn't. Like this, to me, this is the accountability. We talk about the Yellow Coat Club. It's about accountability. It's about telling other people, like, there are more like you. There's more like me. We do this together. It is a club. And I will lead first and say, hey, here's my vulnerable piece. I'm putting the stake in the ground right now. If my life looks the exact same a year from now, then make sure to blow up my email. Hey, you didn't do those things that you said you were going to. But I have a strong feeling that things are going to look very different. Because I know that voice. And I have every intention and every plan to seek first and follow. So my hope for you is that if you're whatever shovel you're holding, that you can look in the mirror long enough to realize that you're holding it and that it just might not be serving you. And whether it's a friend or, through Facebook message, email, some accountability partner, you name it, reach out to somebody and say, hey, I need you to hold me accountable because I'm handing over the shovel. And go and live beyond the story that you are telling yourself today that you can't give this thing up. Because do you want it to be 9 months from now? I'll leave you with this. On the back of the book, The Yellow Coat Club, I was talking to a friend once, and she said that her dad had overcome, or her grandpa had overcome alcoholism. And he used to say to her, day one or one day, you decide. And for me, that was another challenge. That was another mirror moment because I had a lot of one days. No, today can be day one if you want it to be. Today can be day one if you want it to be. Hand over the shovel. Stop digging. And follow me. I think that just as I will be, you will be pleasantly surprised and quite possibly amazed and in awe of what is on the other side. Thank you for joining me today. And as we journey into the new year, man, I'm excited. Terrified at times and excited. And to me, that is all I need to know I'm in the right spot. Thanks for joining me.